To slow down, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Kathy Alderman. I am the Chief Communications and Public Policy Officer for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. I'm joined here with my team and some prestigious presenters this evening to talk about the housing crisis in Colorado and how we can begin to solve it, as long as we are intentional about how we use resources and identify real pressures in the housing market. Just a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded, so it will be made available after the fact, but just wanted folks to know that it is being recorded. If you need accessibility options, captions are available. If you go to the bottom of the screen and hit the CC button, and select show subtitles, you should be able to get captioning. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes and then opening it up for question and answers. So please use the Q&A function to submit questions. This is a webinar format. So guests all have their videos off, their microphones are off, but we will encourage folks to use the chat function to introduce yourselves, to interact with each other, and certainly to let us know if there are any technical issues on your end. And if you are engaged on social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag #CCHEdSeries and tag our participants tonight and each other, so that we can also lift up your comments about this session, excuse me. So tonight I am joined by three of the people that I'm most honored to work with in this space of housing policy. It includes Kenzie Hasted, who is the State and Local Policy Program Director for Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is organized around three central goals: increasing housing supply, advancing racial equity, and building resilience and upward mobility. With 40 years of experience in addressing America's massive shortage of affordable rental homes, Enterprise is the only national nonprofit that does it all: solutions, capital, and community development under one roof. Melissa Mejia is the Director of State and Local Policy for the Community Economic Defense Project, formerly the COVID Eviction Defense Project, in case some of you have seen her in that role, which is leading and supporting policy change to promote housing and economic justice statewide. They partner with low-income and working people to build economic and racial equity by confronting economic abuse and investing in community wealth. They use an ever-evolving set of legal, economic, and advocacy tools to challenge and dismantle unjust systems, building quickly towards a world where all people have what they need to live and thrive. And then a member of our team at Colorado Coalition for the Homeless is Aubrey Wild, who's our Advocacy Program Director, where she specializes in legislative and government affairs activities, including policies related to housing, healthcare, eviction prevention, social justice, criminal justice, and more. The coalition works collaboratively toward the prevention of homelessness and the creation of lasting solutions for families, children, and individuals who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness throughout the state of Colorado. We advocate for and provide a continuum of housing and variety of services to improve the health, well-being, and stability of those we have the opportunity to work along with. So we're going to get this kicked off with a short presentation from our Housing Policy Fellow, Andrew West, who's going to kind of lay the groundwork, set some context for us, and then we will engage in a robust discussion about what we learn from Andrew, and then how we need to think about some of these issues moving forward as we collaboratively work to try to resolve the issue in Colorado. So thank you, Andrew.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy. I appreciate the warm welcome and introduction. Here's a bit of a brief data overview on what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about some big picture numbers, statistics, the way that we actually measure homelessness in Colorado, along with some causes, what is myth, what is fact, and talk about further causes. We're going to talk about housing affordability as the main cause and the correlation that we see there, along with other measures as area median income and housing availability. And yeah, I can kick us off here. Thank you very much. When we talk about homelessness in Colorado, it is although a difficult thing to measure, important to have a baseline of where we're at so we know really what we're talking about with the issue. And approximations really vary here. There's a wide variation, but we do know that the true number of people experiencing homelessness is most likely somewhere between 10,000 and 53,000. And I could break down some of these metrics real quick. The number 10,397 is according to the 2022 point in time count, which is a count conducted once on one night each year that actually measures the number of people experiencing homelessness. And that's conducted through 4 continuum of care programs that exist across the state. However, we know from other measures that number is a bit of an underestimate. 15,374 is the number of students that are experiencing homelessness doubled up or unstably housed in the 2020 or 2021 school year. We also, when looking at HMIS data, which is homelessness management information system, which is a data tracking software that providers use, we see a number of about 32,000 people who access homelessness services throughout the year. And lastly, on the higher range of this estimate is the number of individuals with housing instability or homelessness who are covered by Medicaid, and that is from 2019. So wide range in estimates there, but that gives us a snapshot of what we're looking at. And when we talk about causes of homelessness, this relates to the structural level. So what we see between places, and the strongest correlation is not mental illness, it's not drug use, it's not poverty, it's housing market conditions. We talk about median rent in an area, rental vacancy rates, how many units are unoccupied at any time, and high population growth versus low supply elasticity. So again, it's a bit complicated here, but mostly what we're talking about is places that see large population growth and don't have supply of housing that keeps up, especially for the people who need it most. And I think a good example here is, although there are people who have all the issues on the right, there is mental illness, there's drug use, there's poverty in a lot of different places. You don't necessarily see homelessness everywhere the same across the country. Detroit is one of the poorest cities in the US, but has a per capita homelessness rate that is a third of places like New York and San Francisco. So at the structural level, we do find that housing market conditions really explain the crisis best. And when we talk about those housing market conditions, unsurprisingly, we find that Colorado is the 8th least affordable state in the country in terms of housing wage. And that's up from 9th in the previous year. And we talk about housing wage, that is the wage per hour that is required to afford a 2-bedroom home at fair market rent, which is defined by the U.S. Department of Housing and we have a large shortage of homes ranging somewhere between 142,000 to 225,000 affordable houses. But again, that is just an estimate and skews disproportionately to those who are at the lowest incomes. In terms of correlation, there is about a $100 increase in median rent, which correlates with a 15% increase in estimated homelessness within a region. So again, homelessness is a housing issue at its core. And in Denver and throughout Colorado, but in Denver in particular, home prices rose an average of $94 a day over the last decade. This is an enormous increase from 231,000 to 600,000 and represents a 162% change. And this is a good visual to see exactly what we're talking about. You see a strong correlation between housing availability and homelessness. The darker areas are higher rates. On the right, the darker areas of higher rates of homelessness, and on the left, housing availability is lower for those areas that are darker. So you see Colorado in dark red on the left and a darker shade of blue on the right. But places like California tend to track pretty well across both of these graphs as well. Now, when we talk about those who are at the greatest risk of homelessness and have the least access to housing in the state, we're talking about the lowest income people. And this is defined by area median income, which is the median household income within a municipality, metro area, or a county. And these are designated by area median income percentages. So below 30% of area median income is what we call extremely low income earners. Very low income earners or households are between 30 to 50% area median income. Low income is in that 50 to 80% range, and anyone between about 80 and 120 is middle income. So when we talk about the lowest income earners, what we're really talking about is those below 50%, but extremely low income or very low income, who are at the greatest risk of housing instability and homelessness. Just to give you an idea of what those numbers look like in Colorado, in Bent County, more of a rural region, we have 30% AMI sitting at about 17,000. And this is for one individual. 50% AMI is about 29,000. 80% is about 46,000. And you can see corresponding numbers for Denver here. And these are adjusted annually to reflect inflation, growing prices and everything like that. And here are the numbers for a household of 4. And you see that is reflected to, increased to reflect larger family sizes and spending patterns. All right. So who in particular is struggling to find housing? This is a great graphic from our partners at the National Low Income Housing Coalition that shows affordable and available homes per 100 renters. And it's broken down by area median income. So we see at the lowest level, people at 30% AMI or below are extremely low income earners have about 29 available homes per 100 renters. So there's an enormous shortage there. And same thing for people at 50% AMI, 49 affordable and available homes per 100 renters. But those at 100% of AMI, those who are making median, the area median income, do have enough housing. So again, we see that the group most in need is those with the lowest area median incomes. And again, a little bit more into detail on who is struggling to find housing. People with fixed incomes, including elderly populations, those living with disabilities, and veterans in particular are struggling to afford housing. In Denver, in particular, nearly 60% of disabled renter households spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And that's really the guideline here. What's traditionally used for how much you should be spending is about 30%. And that's the point. Once you reach 30% of your income towards rent, that's considered cost burden. If you're spending higher amounts, once you get to that 50% of your income, we start to talk about severe cost burden. That's when folks are really feeling the pressure of high rent costs. And Colorado actually ranked first for housing instability, unfortunately, for older adults in the US. 1 in 3 survey respondents above the age of 65 expressed low confidence, that being no or slight confidence that they would be able to pay next month's rent. And about 7% of Coloradans experiencing homelessness are veterans, though notably, we have done a good job of reducing homelessness for people who are veterans. And another group that unfortunately struggles to find housing and is at increased risk of homelessness are communities of color and minority groups that are overrepresented within the unhoused population due to some historical inequities and racist policies in both housing and homelessness services throughout the years in our country. You can see this graph on the right shows Colorado home ownership rates over time by race and ethnicity. And communities of color have historically and continue to be way lower on home ownership rates than white Coloradans. Another statistic to illustrate this is that Black Coloradans make up 3 times the amount of population experiencing homelessness than they do the general population. So they are grossly overrepresented there. And again, are one of the groups we talk about when we talk about those who are really most in need. I want to touch on a concept briefly when we talk about renting up or renting down. This is something you might hear a bit later with our panelists, and I'll give it a brief introduction here. When we talk about renting down, we're talking about, for example, a family that earns about $80,000 a year and has several units that are available to them. So if they spend about 30% of their income monthly on rent, which is what is considered affordable, they can afford something in that $2,000 range. And even if there are units affordable at $2,000, they might choose to rent down, like we say, and purchase a unit that is about $1,600 a month to save money, to dedicate a bit less of their income to housing than if they were picking a more expensive unit. On the other hand, when we look at renting up, we talk about low income earners. Again, that's that 30%, 50% area median income who don't have a lot of options available to them at what would be 30% of their income. So they end up spending larger proportions of their income. 50% can be a severe cost burden, but sometimes we've seen numbers much higher, like 75, 80% of their income towards rent. And if there's only things around the higher range that are affordable, they have to rent up to avoid housing instability or homelessness. So what are some solutions that we have here? And I'll let our panel talk a bit more on that as they are the experts. But oftentimes you hear that more housing solves the problem, and it does if it's the right kind. Housing supply overall and in general will not do much unless it's specifically targeted at those with the greatest need. And we implement affordability requirements along with increased density and that sort of thing. And by doing this, by implementing more housing in the right way, we can avoid displacement and gentrification, counter historical inequities, and make sure that the housing that we are building is targeted, it's done intentionally, and that solutions are funding are proportional to the need, which, as I touched on here, falls in the lowest income groups. I think that's about it here. I could pass it off to our panelists in a second, but we do have some opportunities that have emerged recently. Colorado received a lot of ARPA funding and in the tune of about 650 million, in addition to Proposition 123, which fortunately passed in 2022, thanks to some of the work of a lot of our partners, and the coalition was also involved with that. And we also have a lot of upcoming legislation at this year's legislative session. As I'm sure many of you have heard, housing will be a big topic at the state house this year, and we look forward to engaging on that. And I can pass it back to our panelists here.
Thank you, Andrew, for laying that context for us. I do want to remind folks that if you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I'm just going to ask a few kind of basic questions of each panelist. Some of them I'll ask to all three, some of them will be a little more targeted, and then we'll head to the Q&A. So I'm going to start with Kenzie and then go to Melissa and then Aubrey. And just want to say, so we just laid some context here for why we're at the place that we are in terms of the affordable housing crisis, the rise in homelessness. And I'm just wondering, is there a data point that surprised you, or is there something that you thought was missing from that presentation that you think is really important for our participants tonight to know about? And Kenzie, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you, Andrew. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate all the information you laid out for us. And thank you all for being here this evening. I'm glad to be here. So I took notes and had one data point that I found surprising, and then a little bit of additional information I think could be useful for us. So I didn't know first in the for housing instability among older adults. I have seen the data comparing the availability of affordable homes, particularly for low and lower income folks, quite a lot, but I didn't know that data specifically for those who are older. That surprises me and has got me thinking about other things we need to be doing. Another thought for some more information I think would be beneficial, noting on the slide that Andrew showed, showing the correlation between homelessness and the availability of homes. I think it would be useful to have, there was a note in there that vacancy rates are helpful in understanding different trends. And to my knowledge, there are not widely accessible data on vacancy rates in rental units throughout the state. I think that would be a very useful piece of information to have as we continue to compare development versus what's vacant, and trying to dispel some of these myths that we'll be talking about later. And I also think that it would be beneficial. I think there are lots of communities who have done really good work doing housing needs assessments and housing planning. The state government has invested money into those resources in recent years, but to have some of that information more readily accessible to better understand at a comprehensive and statewide level what the actual needs are across the housing spectrum in a local area or a region that is meaningfully inclusive. And I'm thinking that includes folks who are looking for homeownership opportunities, as well as those who are low income, below 80%, as you showed, but especially folks who are living on extremely low incomes and those who might be in need of permanent supportive housing, particularly in the context of this session.
Thank you for that, Kenzie. I hope we're taking notes so that we can make sure to include some of that additional information in our presentation. Melissa, what are your thoughts?
I think probably the most surprising, we kind of know it, but actually seeing it laid out that home prices rose $94 a day. It's just, it is a lot to look at. I mean, if you think about it that way, we've all seen how much it's increased, but that is a wild number to actually kind of try and take in. I think I really appreciate the laying out of the housing market as the strongest correlation with homelessness and not all of these other things that we like to talk about, or that some people like to talk about. I think that's a really good framing for this conversation and how we have to talk about all of these things together within the same conversation as sort of a holistic concept and not as two separate problems. Super important. I think the only thing I'll add to that is, particularly in the work that we do, housing instability is rarely an isolated incident. It's not the only thing that a family is facing. There are usually other things that sort of come along with it and contribute to it. So as much as housing market conditions really affect that, because of the cost of housing, it really puts families into this place of overall economic stability that then leads to general family instability, having to move around, not being as connected to your community. And there are all of these ripple effects when people are facing the cost of housing that they are right now. So really appreciate this framing and just sort of would add on that just being able to find a house and pay your rent, like it's never the end of it. And it really impacts the health, well-being, and overall just quality of life of families.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, that statistic also surprised me. And so I had to do some quick math for a minimum wage earner who's making $13 an hour. That's $104 a day for an 8-hour workday. And if housing costs are rising at $94 a day, that gives you like $10 to spend on something else if you're preparing to buy a home. So tough environment to try to buy a home in Colorado. Aubrey, I know you've seen this data, you've had time to probably sit with it a little longer than our other presenters, but I'm sure there's still something that always surprises you. And I would love to know, kind of when you think about setting context for our participants, what else should we be talking about?
Sure. So yeah, I thought it was a great presentation and familiar with a lot of those numbers. But one thing I'd add is something that I'm asked a lot, which is what percentage of people experiencing homelessness are working? And we know that about 53% of people experiencing homelessness are working at least part-time, and about 40% of people who are experiencing literal street homelessness are working at least part-time. So that tells me is that our housing system is just not working, even for working people. And so when we talk about investments in housing, we need to really be focusing on folks who are, for whom housing is truly out of reach in our city and across the state. And then I also want to call out that graphic that kind of demonstrates what renting down and renting up look like. And to me, that shows that there are a lot of other factors besides maybe just supply and demand that influence our housing market and what's available to people realistically on the ground. And I think that definitely tees up what we're going to talk a lot about tonight.
Great, thanks for that, Aubrey. Yeah, I think, as we have a lot of conversations on policy issues and the allocation of resources, we hear a lot about We need more workforce housing, as if people who are currently experiencing homelessness or extreme housing instability aren't working. Those are some of our hardest community workers, and the fact that there's just no way that their wages can keep up with the cost of housing makes this situation even more precarious. So I appreciate you raising that up. I'm wondering, from, again, all of our panelists, we heard Andrew say in one of those slides, like, why isn't supply enough alone? So we keep hearing, supply, supply, supply. If we just have more housing, then there'll be more housing opportunities for everyone, no matter what their income. But that's just not bearing out. And I'm wondering if you can pontificate on why you believe that is. And I'll start with Kinsey again.
Thank you. Well, I think a couple of things, and I'm excited to have my fellow panelists expand. So, I think data has consistently shown us that the most significant need for increased housing is among those who live on the least, people living on lower or fixed incomes. And so if we are focused on this idea that all new homes are good homes and all we need is an increased supply, we're really playing into the market dynamics that have resulted in the kind of inequity and stunning increase in home prices and really lacking access to affordable homes for those people living on lower and fixed incomes. It just doesn't work that way. The market has and will continue to serve folks living at higher income levels. Our housing market is profit driven by and large. And so when we lean into market driven tools entirely, and focus on this idea of providing more and more housing for folks living at higher income levels, and particularly when we focus our public policies and our public resources at that level, we're really not doing anything to directly serve the needs of people living on lower and fixed income, where we know the need is the greatest. And I think, we have seen a historical disinvestment in those communities. We see often a general lack of political will to invest in those communities. And I'm sure Aubrey can talk more about this idea of trickle-down housing that we hear about, where if you just build more housing, it will benefit everybody, whether the housing is affordable directly to folks making higher incomes, or if the availability will work its way down to folks making less. And the truth of the matter is that increased supply does not mean increased access. And that even if a person is able to find a rental unit and has to spend more than 30 or 50% of their annual income on that unit to just get in the door, it's incredibly hard to remain stably in that unit and continue to pay those really high rental prices on very low wages every month. So that puts those folks at great risk of housing instability. So I'm of the mind we really need to be focusing our public resources to where the greatest need is, and we know that.
Thanks, Kinsey. Melissa, I'm wondering, you work directly with folks that are suffering from housing insecurity, that are trying to get by every single day. I'm wondering if you can talk about, why supply at a higher income level availability just won't work for them.
There's so many ways to answer this question. There's so many pieces of it. I think that we've seen past investments in building, and that thus far has not created more affordability. If anything, it it serves a very specific community, and that is not the people who need it. It is not at the price point, but it is also not the type of housing that's needed. So I think that's another big thing to really highlight in this conversation, is just building more is not the answer, because often what we see is that building more means studios, 1 bedroom, maybe some 2 bedroom, and that doesn't help a family of 5. That doesn't help a multi-generational family who is potentially having to find a new place to live, who is getting priced out, whose rent has gone up, they have to find something more affordable, they need to relocate, but finding the actual space for your family isn't possible. So that puts people in a really tough position already, and then they have to find something that's affordable. And so I think what we see a lot of is a combination of landlords who are trying to get as much as they can for a unit. They see prices going up, they see who is moving here. So there's a lot of turnover in order to get the type of tenant that they want at the price point that they think they can get for a property. That tends to happen in places that are labeled up and coming at really high rates, which leads to gentrification and displacement, which I know we're going to get to at some point. But that market solution really directly accelerates those kinds of patterns. And the other thing is we see a lot of big landlords, or at least property management companies, that just sort of have blanket solutions or blanket practices. It's not really about keeping people housed. It's not about working with tenants. It's about getting rid of people who aren't paying, or getting rid of people who can't pay as much as you think you can get for a unit. There was just, excuse me, some investigation into practices that was published recently about collusion amongst property managers and how they set rent prices. And so as much as we want to talk about the market setting those prices, and if we increase supply, it's going to pull everything down, we A, have seen that not happen, B, know that that still doesn't help the people in the most need, and then C, they're not even playing by market rules. I don't know that that's a surprise to anyone, but now we have evidence that that's not happening. So it takes all of these tools that we have, and all of us talking about this as much as possible to make sure that we're actually serving people who are facing housing instability.
Thanks for that answer, Melissa. Yeah, I think it really speaks to the intentionality of trying to keep things affordable. And if we're not intentional, if we're not directive, if we don't say what affordability actually means, and that we just let market be the answer to that the market will intentionally keep things unaffordable for people who can't pay more. I mean, that's what the market is about. That is what capitalism is for. Aubrey, so Kenzie said it, trickle-down housing. Wondering if you can talk a little bit, about kind of that concept and why it just doesn't work in the housing space.
That term triggers an automatic eye roll for me now after having done a deep dive into some of the research on it. So yeah, this is a really troubling trend that we're seeing, where people they believe that investing at the market rate level will trickle down to everybody on the housing ladder, even the lowest income folks. And this is also referred to as filtering. And this basically uses the same tenets as trickle-down economics, the failed economic model from the 1980s. And it doesn't work the way that people are suggesting that it does. It works in some ways, but we have to ask, how quickly does it work? For whom does it work? And then, is that the appropriate tool or primary tool to rely on in Colorado and in Denver's market right now, and in the housing and homelessness crises we're in? So it does work in that if we wait between 10 and 50 years, housing that's built at the top of the rental market, luxury housing, will eventually become affordable to folks at the middle income level. So it'll become more middle income type housing. So it takes decades. And there's actually no evidence to suggest that it ever becomes truly affordable to those who are at the lowest income levels, including people experiencing homelessness, working minimum wage jobs, people on fixed incomes, seniors, folks with disabilities. And so it works really slowly, and it doesn't really work for the folks that we're focusing on. And then, is it a good solution for Colorado? And the answer there is no. There are a lot of factors cited by the researchers on filtering that indicate that there are factors that slow down filtering. And that includes things like low construction, which Colorado has seen a major decrease in construction over the last decade compared to the decade before. High population growth. Colorado and Denver has seen a lot of population growth, and high inflation. We all are feeling the effects of that. So in places where all of those factors are present, filtering doesn't really work, and it works even more slowly than this decades-long process. And even when it does start to trickle down a little bit, almost all of that benefit to lower income households is offset by low income housing being taken off the market because it's in disrepair and it's not habitable. So I guess I skipped one piece, which is kind of the general idea that if we build more as previously luxury units depreciate, people in those units will move into those brand new units, freeing up these older spaces for people with lower incomes. And yeah, the research just doesn't bear it out that that is a really viable strategy. And to Kinsey's point, we have limited resources, and those public resources should be used strategically.
Yeah, and I think, the idea of trickle-down housing and filtering, really heralds to, the supply and demand concept that may be true for widgets and cars and groceries, but housing is such a different creature, right? Because housing, where you live depends where you want your kids to go to school, where your job is, whether you want to be close to a park or close to transit, right? So housing is in and of itself is not the same kind of commodity that trickle down, economics was really intended to address. So another thing that Andrew said is that we hear a lot about density. So we just need more. So like supply, let's get more housing, but let's make sure we get a lot more in certain places. And some people talk about that, being in urban corridors or along transit. But that also comes with some specific issues of its own if it's not intentional. Kinsey, you started talking about using public resources, really targeting those for those in the greatest need. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how that may relate to density policies.
I would be happy to. So I think any attempt to intentionally accelerate the market and increase density, particularly in areas that already have relatively high density or around areas associated with transit that are very likely to bring in more people and more business and more wealth. The wealth-making opportunities are significant in those instances. There's just no way around it. And so there has to be meaningful and intentional policies and I think financial resources dedicated to ensuring that meaningful affordability is part of any new significant increase in density. And especially that neighborhoods and communities that have long been the most vulnerable to involuntary displacement, or being, folks who have long lived in a neighborhood and are most likely to be forced out of their homes as wealthier and often whiter residents move into those areas. Those neighborhoods need to be specifically paid attention to and listened to and protected from experiencing the kind of extraordinarily quickly rising home and rental prices that we see in increases in density. So, I think there's lots of conversations and media coverage around likely statewide land use legislation coming forward. And we believe very clearly that any consideration for increasing density and trying to house more people, I think the principle of trickle-down housing holds here too. The idea that if we just build more, and if we build it in places where there already are people, and if we build it in places where people can access transit, that will just take care of itself. And we've already talked about how that just simply isn't true. So any of these efforts and investments really do have to come with very clear and intentional affordability requirements and incentives, and again, resources. I think in order to provide homes that are affordable to folks living on low and fixed incomes, there has to be subsidy associated with those. We know that. And so I think finding ways to invest meaningfully in ensuring that we don't further leave certain communities and households behind is really critical. Otherwise, we're just going to further exacerbate existing disparities, and we're going to accelerate involuntary displacement and gentrification. And that's just, it's offensive, it's racist, and I think that we have to be incredibly mindful of how we go about these potential increases in density.
Yeah, thanks, Kenzie. I think, we know that there have been so many barriers for, specific populations and accessing housing throughout history that have, really resulted in, locations, certain communities being, kind of located or forced to locate in certain areas. And now those areas are very highly desirable for development. And so, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of talk about, what does that mean for these communities that have already faced these historical barriers to now be confronted with the notion of displacement and gentrification, and how does that create and exacerbate further harm?
Yeah, I think it's really important when we talk about density, zoning changes, where we put investments, to understand that every place has its own history. There are generations of systemic racism and disenfranchisement and really intentional discrimination that have gotten us to the place that we are in right now. And that looks different in every place. And so when we have these big ideas and national solutions that feel like the answer, it's really attractive to have the answer to these really complex issues. But the way that they play out in different places really depends on that history. And so we see that play out in a lot of different ways. To Kinsey's point, a lot of where we put investment and density when we relate it to transit is in neighborhoods that are already super vulnerable. It is in neighborhoods that have historically been underinvested in. And that influx of attention and investment and amenities and access is both long overdue and puts them at major risk of displacement because it hasn't existed. All of a sudden it comes in. People have been asking for this for generations. And when you get it all at once, you get attention on the neighborhood, you get an increase in property taxes, you get an increase in rents, and you get a bunch of attention as an up and coming neighborhood that brings really direct real estate marketing to accelerate, those increases in property values and in rents, and really intentionally displaces the people that were already there. And we've seen this happen in neighborhoods in Denver. It is a major risk. You have to have safeguards for communities that are already there and ways to invest in the communities that exist in order to make sure that that doesn't happen. Otherwise, just targeting density is going to exacerbate these generational inequalities. It's really important to understand that just increasing density doesn't only happen in places where there historically hasn't been access. So like Denver is this unusual example of single family zoned neighborhoods that were formerly redlined. And so you don't have populations there that look like other places where there's single family zoning. You have people who could only buy in certain places, who created this generational wealth that they were told that they should find for their families, who have tried to create that. And if you just blanketly change density, those are the places that investors are going to go first. That real estate costs less than building in a wealthier single family neighborhood. And so that displacement just gets accelerated. What happens when you have all of these communities displaced is they lose their connection to schools, to families, to support systems, to culture, everything that made them attractive in the first place. All of those people get totally removed. And so it's not just the housing that gets lost, it is businesses, it is culture, it is the well-being of entire communities of families and not just single individual households. So I will stop there, but yeah, we got to be careful with density. It is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I talk about a lot is the fact that if you're going to go in and allow density, which is essentially, you know, an allowance to build more, to sell more, to rent more, to make more money, if that property is not affordable to the household that you displaced to be able to do that, then your housing policies are failing. So I appreciate that perspective. Thank you, Melissa. Aubrey, we've talked a lot about, you know, marginalized communities, low income communities, but, you know, we just kind of brushed on, I think, some of the issues of households that are living on fixed incomes. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about some of the additional complexities that our seniors, that are veterans, that people living with disabilities are facing in this housing crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a great issue brief out that does a really deep dive into what it means to live with a disability in terms of housing access and income and everything. So I think that's a great resource that maybe somebody can drop in the chat. But yeah, folks who are on fixed incomes are really left out of the consideration in our housing market and in a lot of these conversations. So not only is it important to build at a level that is available and accessible to folks, but universal design is also a really important piece of the puzzle. And I think it's worth noting that newer housing is more likely to be built with universal design compared to older housing that might be trickling down eventually to somebody. So that's one factor. And then as Andrew mentioned in the introduction, there's a huge intersection with folks who are aging Coloradans, and 1 in 3 survey respondents in a 2021 survey said that they have slight confidence or no confidence that they could pay their rent. So that's something worth considering. And then I think there's also a deep intersection with veterans, and that actually provides a really good example of how targeted investment can be really effective. So in a lot of communities, there have been across the country, there have been large investments in the housing first approach for veterans, meaning we'll give somebody a roof and 4 walls if they're ready for it. And then at their pace, they can choose their goals. They can pursue vocational training and deal with mental health challenges and whatever else is part of their plan. But first, that starts with a home. And then we can add on all of those supportive services to help get them to their goal. And so a lot of the communities that have done this have reached functional zero. So basically meaning they're the number of people becoming homeless, excuse me, and the number of people exiting homeless are basically equal each other out in any given month. And so this just gives us a great example of how we can be really thoughtful with any new funds coming into the system, so that we can actually support the folks that are the most vulnerable in some of these specific subpopulations.
Great, thanks for that. Well, I'm going to go one more round of questions and then go to the Q&A. So there's got to be some solutions, right? So we've talked about the issues. I think we know we need to be intentional. We need to think about how we're using public resources. We need to think about policies that don't do any more harm. But Kenzie, I think something that Andrew mentioned was, you know, that we need to target resources that are demonstrated to proportional needs. Can you tell me what that means?
I can, thank you. So I think one of the most concerning trends to me in recent years here in Colorado is that, well, on the good side, we have seen a huge investment in housing. A lot of new ARPA dollars, those one-time federal funds for pandemic recovery, came into the state, and the legislature and the governor dedicated them to housing. And lots of bills and programs came from these funds, as well as state efforts to help recover from the pandemic. However, I think it's concerning to me that those unprecedented funds, which unprecedented though they are, will go extraordinarily quickly, and we're already seeing that, that those funds are able to go to households making much, much more than people who are living on the least, and the people who our systems have historically and continue to shut out of housing and housing stability. And so even though there was a significant investment in housing in recent years here in Colorado that was very welcome and very needed, I'm concerned that it is not going to go far enough for the people who have forever, and unless we change something, will forever really need it most. Because again, we're talking about public policies and interventions and public resources. And so what I hope to see is, for instance, the implementation of Proposition 123, which Andrew also mentioned. As passed by the voters, it really seeks to increase housing that is meaningfully accessible and sustainably affordable to renters in communities across the state who are living on 60% of their area's median income or less. And to be clear, many, many, many people across the state live on much less than 60% of their area median income and deserve homes. And similarly, Proposition 123 directs funds to communities that will increase the availability of housing, for sale housing, to folks living, I think it's at 100% of, or the equivalent of their area median income. It might be 90. Kathy or operator Melissa could correct me. But I really think that looking ahead, one, we really need to be aware of and track the impact of all of the dollars that have recently flowed into the state and know who's benefiting. And I think really importantly, know who is not, and adjust accordingly. And two, you know, this ongoing resource for affordable housing that was created when voters passed Proposition 123, I think the voice of the voters needs to be respected, and we need to direct those funds toward, again, the communities where we know and where there's evidence that a public investment is needed. Otherwise, things not only won't change, but they will get worse.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you know, I think we all agree that there is a housing crisis across the spectrum of incomes for people in Colorado. And the real debate, as you talked about earlier, is how do you use public resources to address that crisis when the market truly can provide solutions at one end of the income spectrum and not the other. Melissa, so we've been talking about, you know, development and supply and making more homes available, but can you talk about stabilization and prevention efforts as being part of the solution to our housing crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I also very happy that we have made all of these investments. It's very exciting to see everybody actually really interested and motivated in talking about housing and finding solutions, because this has been a problem in Colorado for a long time. The problem is that all of these investments, regardless of where on the sort of income spectrum they serve, are going to take time. And we have people in crisis right now. So, you know, getting this money out, building, creating all of this new housing that we really do genuinely need, you know, it takes 2, 3, 4 years at least to make that happen. And we, as an organization that does eviction defense and rental assistance, have not slowed down. People cannot afford rents today and are losing their homes right now. So it is super important to know that that is happening, that there are families who are on the verge of entering the homelessness services continuum as we speak. And so as we make all of these investments into housing, we have to also make sure that all of these families are getting the supports and access to services that they need right now, so that they don't fall into homelessness, so that they don't become displaced, so that they don't leave the state, which is something that we're actually seeing a lot. And then when all of these units come online, they're not even here anymore to take advantage of them. So we really need an approach that covers all of those pieces of the puzzle and not just focusing on the building.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think we all know that, you know, once somebody enters the cycle of homelessness, it's so much more expensive for them to get out of it than it is to prevent it up front. So Aubrey, I think we've got some good conversation happening in the chat, and we have great participation on the call. So what can we tell our participants to do to support the work at the state legislature to make sure that we are enacting these policies?
Great question, Kathy. So folks can go ahead and follow all three of our organizations. We're all pretty active on social media platforms, and occasionally we'll have calls to action when some bills come up with the legislature that might have to do with how money is being used or protections for renters. So we really encourage engagement there. You can always call or email your legislators, and you can follow along with what's happening at the legislature by Googling Colorado General Assembly. All that information is public, and you can also go to the Capitol anytime you want. It's your house, so feel free to go there and learn and engage in conversation with advocates as well as legislators. Let them know what you want to see in your community. CCH is also going to have a lobby day coming up soon. And so once we have nailed down dates and times, you all will be notified of that. And we encourage everyone to participate, and we'll give you some tips and tricks on how to be an effective volunteer lobbyist on some of these issues we care the most about.
Great. Thanks, and I hope people will take us up on that offer and share the resources that we provided today, as well as maybe the recording of this after the fact. We are coming up on time, but I do want to answer the questions, so I'm hoping folks can just hang on a little longer if they're interested, but certainly jump off if you need to. The first question is, what specific policies and programs do we want our Denver mayoral candidates to be thinking about? I think we've heard a lot here about, anti-displacement and anti-gentrification policies, targeting resources to the lowest income, targeting resources to programs that actually work to resolve homelessness. And those are all issues that the candidates have been talking about. But I'm going to do kind of a quick, keep it under 30 seconds response. What haven't we heard from the candidates yet that we should be hearing? And I'll go in reverse order this time. Aubrey, I'll start with you.
Well, we wouldn't be Colorado Coalition for the Homeless if we didn't say we need to address the criminalization of homelessness. And you all may have already seen some really nasty ads blaming people experiencing homelessness for rising crime and degradation of our city. And that's just really misguided. And so would love to see a mayor take a more compassionate approach to homelessness in conjunction with all of these targeted housing investments we're talking about.
Thanks, Aubrey. Melissa, what would you like to hear?
I think a lot of the displacement and things that we have talked about, it really hits families. I know that Denver has done some work on that front, and the mayor doesn't control DPS, but working with DPS to make sure that teachers can afford to live here, but also that these neighborhood schools that serve as community and service hubs for some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods, that we're investing in them, and that we are figuring out how we can support DPS and making sure that we don't lose that community resource.
Excellent point. Kenzie?
I would say meaningful investments in housing stability. I think it's been a little disheartening coming off of, and I don't mean to say that, coming through the pandemic. A lot of people are still really suffering the effects of the pandemic. We're not through it. And it's been disheartening as particularly federal resources for housing stability have dried up, and there's a perception that we are through the pandemic, that policy responses have not taken priority, that housing stability as a component of an important partner to housing supply is really being left off the table. So I'd love to see somebody talking more about that, and programs and investments in keeping folks who are currently housed from being evicted and finding themselves experiencing homelessness.
Great, thanks for that. There are two questions that seem a little specific to the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless that I think I can answer quickly. One is about the affordable housing linkage fee. Yes, the coalition does work with the city to access those funds to build supportive housing and other affordable housing workarounds. We were very supportive of that policy in 2016 and the increase in funding that it provided by the 2017 revisions to it. There was also a question about sober living and somebody hearing that maybe CCH isn't working with sober living facilities. I think to Aubrey's point earlier, we definitely operate under a housing first philosophy. And so if somebody identifies sober living as a way for them to be successful, we help them find that, but we certainly don't make it a requirement for them to get into housing. And then I feel like, oh, the last question is, how can we keep the cost of housing down? And I'm going to end it with this question. So how, it's increasing, $94 a day. Rents are up over 20% annually. What are some tactics that we should be thinking about to keep the cost of at least stabilizing, if not bringing the cost of housing down? And I'll start with Melissa this time.
This is where I get on my consumer protection soapbox. I think there's a lot of like legislative ideas. There's a lot of things that we can do. There's a lot of investments in supply that we can make. The reality is that we have seen a lot of corporate investment in housing types across the board, single family through multifamily. We have seen corporate ownership of property management really increase. We have evidence of collusion in setting rent prices. And at the end of the day, we can have as much housing supply as we want. We can make all of these investments. We can have social housing or affordable housing that's managed by the city, whatever it is. But that market rate, if we continue to not intervene in this corporate ownership of so much of our housing stock in Denver and the practices that they engage in, it's not going to change. And so totally different answer than what we've been talking about right now. But at the end of the day, like doing this work all of the time, it's really, it is a consumer protection issue and we have to start treating it. If the market is going to treat housing like a commodity, then we need to regulate them like a commodity if we are going to have it also serve as a social good.
Kenzie, what are your thoughts about keeping the cost of housing at the very least stable, if not maybe bringing it down?
I agree with everything Melissa said. I think we need to also pay attention to investing in and preserving housing that is currently affordable. Colorado loses deed restricted housing or housing that's been built with certain federal, state, or local funds, and therefore, along with that funding comes restrictions on affordability levels and long-term affordability. But those deeds or those restrictions expire. And so Colorado is losing deed restricted affordable housing at a very high rate. And we are losing housing that is, usually slightly older. If you live in Denver, think about houses or apartment complexes on Cap Hill to, capital market driven forces and conglomerate landlords who will buy out those fine and well kept, currently affordable or more affordable multifamily complexes and turn them into luxury or highly amenitized apartments that more and more folks can't afford. So I think really being mindful of policies and investments in preservation of deed restricted and non-deed restricted affordable housing.
Great, thanks for that. And Aubrey, what are your thoughts about how do we bring costs down, or how do we make housing more affordable to people currently? And then I've just been notified that we actually do have until 6:15, so we still have a few more minutes. So that means I get to come up with the very last question for our panelists after you answer, Aubrey.
Well, I agree with everything that Melissa and Kinsey said. But I think it's worth also noting that affordability is an issue as well as availability and access. And landlords are, of course, raising rents to the maximum that they can to make money in a lot of cases, like was mentioned earlier. But they're also discriminating against people based on finances or based on where their income comes from still. Colorado and Denver and Boulder passed source of income non-discrimination policies in the last few years, which means that landlords can't reject people for using a voucher or getting their income from federal disability benefits or another source that isn't your traditional wages. But landlords are getting around this by requiring that people earn 3, 4, 5, even 8 times the rent amount in order to be qualified to rent that home. And also jacking up security deposits really high, and just finding different ways to keep housing inaccessible to people that they might have biases against, including lower income folks. So I think there's a lot we can do to address issues like that, in addition to the other strategies that were mentioned.
Great. Well, we've certainly talked a lot about the problems, the potential solutions, and I do want to try to end this on some kind of positive note. So what makes you optimistic that we can get it right in Colorado? And I'll start with you, Kenzie.
That's not fair. What makes me optimistic? I mean, this is going to be a real cheeseball answer, but I look at the people who are here presenting and the organizations we represent and the different areas of the work that we all strive to do in service of the same group of people, I think. I look at all of you who decided to attend a webinar on your free time at 5 o'clock on a Thursday to learn and engage in a discussion with us. And I think the awareness of the housing affordability and stability crisis is particularly heightened coming through the pandemic. And I really hope that people continue to stay engaged. And I really admire the work of so many of my partner organizations who have been doing this work for a long time and are not giving up anytime soon. I think everybody has a place in this, and I think all of our voices are stronger together, of course. And so I just am really grateful for all of the innovative ideas that come from my partners and the hard work they put in and their willingness to be open and collaborate. So that's my optimism, everybody here.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. And as somebody who works in the space with you quite a bit, it is great to have strong partners. And I think as much as we can lift up each other's issues and voices, it does mean that we can make changes in policies that haven't budged in years. So I am happy to do the work. What about you, Melissa? What are you feeling optimistic about in terms of whether or not we're going to make progress in this housing crisis?
Trying to have a little bit of a different answer, but honestly, kind of similarly to Kinsey, like having this conversation 5 years ago was completely different than it is now. The attention and awareness on housing as a central issue to health and community and all of these other things, it's in a totally different place than it used to be. It used to be a very niche issue. Not everybody wanted to talk about it. People certainly didn't want to throw money and resources at it the way that they are right now. So that's, you know, for whatever reason we got here, that is a massive change, and appreciate everyone who is leaning into this conversation and leaning into this new attention and platform, and try and make sure that that gets directed to the people that need it most and that have been talking about it the most. I think on top of that, you know, when you talk about something like redlining or discriminatory housing practices, that's not a new idea to people anymore. So we are moving in a direction not only of wanting to talk about housing, but really centering it in the history that has gotten us here and centering equity. Could we be better about actually acting on equity? Absolutely, but it's not a new concept anymore, and we don't have to push as hard to have it be part of the conversation. So I think we have to keep pushing there, but the fact that we've made noticeable progress is a big deal, and the fact that everybody in this space is talking about those issues and not just the people who have been impacted by it or talking about it, that makes a big difference. So
yeah, it's a great answer. I tell people all the time, 7 years ago when we started talking about homelessness and housing policy at the Capitol, there were like 5 people who wanted to listen. And now, double-edged sword may it be, everybody's talking about housing. So, but it does mean we can make much more progress and that we can elevate the issues. Aubrey, I'm wondering if you can shed some light on things that we should be optimistic about, not just in the housing crisis, which is part of the homelessness crisis, but what are some bright spots maybe in homelessness resolution and prevention that we haven't seen before.
I'm glad you switched it up, because I was going to say the partnerships too. So I think what is a source of optimism for me is that we know what works. We have gotten some really great data around the housing first approach through the social impact bond, which again puts people into housing before anything else. It saves communities money, and it helps people be successful in housing. And after 3 years, over 80% of people remain housed when we take this approach. So I think just having that really clear direction and those data-driven approaches that we know work just tell me that we're heading in the right direction. And with all of these great champions in the space, I think we'll make some real change.
Great. Hey, thanks, friends, colleagues. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, your willingness to participate also on an evening on Thursday night, as we all look forward to Friday and a long weekend for many. I appreciate everyone who joined us tonight. It's really important to us that you care about what we have to say, which means we'll show up again next month. And we'll look forward to talking on a more one-on-one level about homelessness, about accessing services, causes, solutions, and really look forward to engaging in further discussion with you all. I hope everyone has a very safe evening, a wonderful weekend, and thanks again to all of you.